Before the legends, before the marble statues and cinematic slow motion, there was a society built not on glory, but on discipline. This story does not begin with heroic speeches or dramatic poses. It begins with silencian silence, the kind forged by hunger, repetition, and an unyielding system that shaped boys into soldiers long before they understood what fear was. King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans were not born as myths. They were products of the agogia state-controlled way of life that demanded endurance over comfort, obedience over ego, and sacrifice over survival. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were trained to endure hardship without complaint, to move as one body rather than as individuals, and to value duty above life itself. Strength was not admired unless it was controlled. Courage was meaningless unless it served the state. This is the Sparta rarely shown, not a fantasy of flawless heroes, but a harsh, disciplined society where survival was never guaranteed and honor was measured by how much pain one could carry in silence. Leonidas did not stand at Thermopylae because he sought fame. He stood because the system that raised him left no room for retreat. His choices were shaped long before the battlefield be laws, customs, and expectations that defined what it meant to be Spartan. In this series, we peel back the myth and return to the human reality behind the legend. We explore how endurance was engineered, how discipline replaced fear, and how sacrifice became inevitable rather than heroic. This is not a story about fantasy warriors. It is about how a society can mold ordinary men into symbols remembered for thousands of years. If you're ready to look beyond the legend and understand the real forces that shaped King Leonidas and the 300, you're in the right place. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we uncover the history behind the myth-owned story at a time. The silence that shaped Spartan discipline also shaped how they looked, how they lived, and how they were remembered. The men forged by the agoge did not train in shaded courtyards or enclosed halls, but under an open Mediterranean sky where sun, dust, and exertion marked the body as surely as any scar. Sparta existed in the southern heart of Greece, a land of heat, stone, and relentless physical demand, where generations of labor and warfare left visible traces on skin and muscle alike. This was not an isolated northern frontier, but a crossroads of the ancient Mediterranean world, bound by trade, migration, and war to Africa, the Near East, and Anatolia. Ancient writers never imagined Sparta as racially uniform or abstractly white in the modern sense. Their world did not think in those terms. Difference was understood through climate, geography, and way of life. People who lived under strong sun, who labored outdoors, who trained constantly for war, were expected to look hardened by those conditions. Darkened skin was not an identity marker. It was an outcome. The Spartans themselves did not pause to explain this, because to them it required no explanation. It was simply the appearance of men shaped by environment and discipline. Early Greek art reflected this reality without hesitation. Vase paintings and sculptures once carried deep reds, browns, and earth tones, presenting warriors as living bodies rather than pale abstractions. Only later were those colors stripped away, leaving behind white stone that modern audiences mistook for original intent. What survived was form without context, muscle without climate, history without environment. Over time, these emptied images became the foundation for a myth that Sparta had never claimed for itself. The alteration did not happen in antiquity, but centuries later, when Europe began searching the ancient world for reflections of its own identity. As empires expanded and hierarchies hardened, the past was reshaped to serve the present. A disciplined, feared, and admired warrior society became a convenient ancestor, but only after its Mediterranean reality was softened and recolored. Features shaped by sun and labor were smoothed away, connections to Africa and the Near East quietly minimized, and Sparta was recast as a prototype of something it had never been. This revision required more than aesthetic change. It demanded selective memory. The broader Mediterranean world in which Sparta operated was pushed to the margins. Trade routes linking Greece to Egypt and the Levant faded from popular narratives. Artistic evidence was reframed. Texts were interpreted through later assumptions rather than ancient understanding. What remained was a simplified image, a society frozen in white marble, detached from the environment that produced it. Yet the deeper story refuses to disappear. Climate leaves marks that cannot be argued away. Geography insists on connection. Ancient authors consistently described a world in motion, where people, customs, and influences crossed seas with ease. Sparta was not an exception to this world. It was a product of it. Its warriors were not symbols designed for modern ideals, but men formed by a landscape that demanded endurance and a system that demanded obedience. Seen this way, the appearance of the Spartans is no longer a controversy, but a consequence. They looked like men of the southern Mediterranean, because that is where they lived, trained, and fought. Their bodies carried the history of sun, scarcity, and relentless discipline, not because they wished to represent anything, but because reality left its imprint. To understand Sparta honestly is to accept that its power did not come from mythic purity, but from adaptation to a harsh world that shaped everyone within it. When modern portrayals erase that context, they do more than change appearances. They remove Sparta from the living Mediterranean world and place it in an imagined vacuum. Restoring that context does not diminish the Spartans. It grounds them. It returns Leonidas and his warriors to history, not as symbols molded for later comfort, but as men forged by a sun-heavy world that demanded everything and offered nothing in return. To understand Sparta clearly, it must be placed back into the world that produced it, a world that did not end at the borders of Greece, nor imagine itself as isolated or uniform. The ancient Mediterranean was a shared space, a moving world of sailors, soldiers, traders, and storytellers. So here, where Africa, Asia, and Europe met not as distant continents but as neighboring shores. Ideas crossed water as easily as ships, and people moved along the same routes as goods, myths, and armies. Sparta did not stand outside this world. It stood firmly within it. Classical writers understood this reality instinctively. When Herodotus described human difference, he did not reach for abstract categories or rigid divisions. Instead, he looked to the land itself. Climate, sun, water, and habit shaped the body, just as training shaped the warrior. People from hotter regions were darker, those from colder lands lighter, not because of inherited labels, but because environment worked upon them over generations. This was observation, not ideology. For this is indeed, Herodotus wrote of Egyptians as dark-skinned and of peoples shaped by their geography, not to elevate or diminish them, but to explain the visible world as it was. In this context, Sparta appears not as an anomaly, but as a southern Mediterranean society forged under conditions similar to those of its neighbors. The Peloponnese sat closer to North Africa and the Near East than to northern Europe, connected by sea lanes that had been active for centuries before Leonidas was born. Phoenician, traders, Egyptian, priests, Anatolian migrants, commissioned classes and Greek settlers all moved through this shared space, leaving traces in language, religion, art, and custom. The Spartan world absorbed these influences not through imitation, but through proximity and exchange. Ancient Greeks themselves never imagined their civilization as sealed off. Herodotus traced religious practices, heroic lineages, and cultural knowledge southward and eastward, often toward Egypt and Libya. He recorded traditions that openly acknowledged learning from older civilizations, and he treated these connections as natural rather than threatening. For him, Greece was young, dynamic, and indebted to what came before. Sparta, with its claims of ancient lineage and divine descent, fit comfortably within this worldview. When modern readers project contemporary ideas of race onto this ancient landscape, the past becomes distorted. The people of antiquity did not organize themselves by fixed categories of color or ancestry. They spoke instead of heat and cold, dryness and moisture, mountains and plains. A man shaped by sun and labor looked different from one raised in cooler climates, and this difference required no further explanation. The Spartans, trained relentlessly outdoors and bound to a land of intense light and heat, reflected those conditions in their appearance just as surely as fishermen or farmers elsewhere in the Mediterranean did. This understanding was once visible in ancient art. Early Greek painters and sculptors did not hesitate to show variation in skin tone or physical form. Warriors were rendered in deep earth colors, bodies thickened by training and labor. faces marked by the realities of life rather than idealized symmetry. These were not symbolic choices but descriptive ones. Art mirrored environment. Over time, as pigments faded or were deliberately removed, later generations mistook absence for intention and whiteness for origin. By removing Sparta from its Afro-Eurasian setting, modern narratives strip it of the very forces that shaped it. The discipline of the agoge, the endurance of the soldier, and the severity of Spartan law make sense only within a world where survival depended on adaptation to harsh conditions and constant readiness. Sparta's values were not abstract virtues but responses to geography, climate, and regional pressure. They were born of a world that demanded cohesion and resilience. Seen through ancient eyes, Sparta was never meant to represent a single lineage or future ideology. It was one expression of a vast Mediterranean system, shaped by contact as much as by conflict. Herodotus and his contemporaries did not try to separate Greece from Africa or Asia. They described a continuum, a shared human space defined by movement and environment. Restoring Sparta to that world does not rewrite history. It returns it to the place where it always belonged, grounded in land, climate, and the interconnected reality of the ancient Mediterranean. Beneath the discipline that defined Sparta and the wider Mediterranean world that shaped it, there existed another reality, one without which the Spartan system could not survive. The strength, unity, and permanence of Spartan power rested not only on its citizen warriors, but on a vast population whose labor sustained the entire state. These were the Helots, a people conquered, bound to the land, and forced into a role that made Sparta possible while denying them recognition in its glory. The Spartan citizen lived for war because someone else worked the fields, harvested the grain, raised the children, and maintained daily life. That responsibility fell almost entirely on the Helots. They farmed the land that fed the army, produced the surplus that supported communal mess halls, and freed Spartan men from labor so they could train continuously. Without this foundation, the agoge would collapse, the military lifestyle would end, and Sparta would become just another Greek city-state struggling to balance survival with ambition. Yet the Helots were never distant servants hidden behind walls. They lived among the Spartans, worked their land, accompanied them on campaigns, and often marched beside them in war. They were physically strong from generations of agricultural labor and numerous enough to outnumber the ruling elite by many times over. This imbalance haunted Spartan society. Ancient writers noted that fear, not contempt, shaped Spartan policy toward the Helots. A system built entirely around control could never afford complacency. This fear was not abstract. It shaped law, custom, and ritual. Spartan officials regularly declared a state of war against the Helots, a legal maneuver that stripped violence of consequence and normalized intimidation as policy. Young men trained in secrecy, sent into the countryside to monitor and eliminate those deemed dangerous, not as punishment for rebellion, but as prevention against the possibility of one. Such measures reveal a truth often overlooked. No society invests this level of effort unless it believes its power is fragile. The contradiction at the heart of Sparta was profound. The same society that celebrated discipline, loyalty, and unity among its citizens ruled through permanent tension and mistrust over the majority of its population. Spartan equality existed only within a narrow circle. Beyond it lay a controlled world where strength was exploited but never rewarded, and loyalty was demanded without protection. The Helots were essential to victory, yet excluded from memory. In battle, their role was unavoidable. They carried supplies, tended to the wounded, and in many cases fought alongside Spartan hoplites. Their presence expanded the army's reach and endurance. Yet when stories of heroism were told, their names were omitted, their sacrifices absorbed into the legend of others. Spartan glory required their invisibility. Remembering them too clearly would expose how dependent the system truly was. This reliance deepened Spartan anxiety. The ruling elite knew that their way of life was not self-sustaining. Every harvest, every campaign, every generation depended on a population that had little reason to accept its condition. Revolts did occur, conspiracies were uncovered, and ancient historians recorded the constant measures taken to prevent uprising. Sparta lived in a state of readiness, not only against foreign enemies, but against those who made its existence possible. Understanding this relationship reshapes the image of Sparta entirely. The famed discipline of its warriors was inseparable from the fear that disciplined them. The unity praised by later generations was built atop enforced division. The courage celebrated at Thermopylae existed alongside a system that relied on silence, control, and exclusion at home. Spartan power was real, but it was never secure. By restoring the helots to the narrative, Sparta becomes less mythic and more human. It appears not as a flawless machine of warriors, but as a society balanced precariously on inequality. Its greatness did not emerge in isolation, nor was it sustained by will alone. It was upheld daily by an oppressed population whose labor and presence shaped every aspect of Spartan life, even as their story was pushed into the shadows. To see Sparta clearly is to recognize that its strength was inseparable from the people it feared most. As the layers of Spartan myth are peeled away, a quieter body of evidence begins to surface, one that does not announce itself with spectacle, but persists through fragments of art, lines of text, and traces of color left behind by time. This evidence does not claim that Sparta belonged to a single modern category, but it consistently places its elite within a wider Afro-Asiatic Mediterranean world that later generations found inconvenient to remember. What survives is not a single proof, but a convergence, where artistic, historical, and textual traces point in the same direction. Ancient Greek art offers the first clue, not through what it has become, but through what it once was. Early Spartan and Greek visual culture did not present warriors as pale figures carved from untouched stone. Vase paintings and reliefs depicted human bodies in deep reds, browns, and dark earth tones, with features shaped by sun, labor, and environment. So here, these were not symbolic colors chosen at random, but descriptive ones meant to convey living flesh under Mediterranean light. Modern pigment analysis has confirmed that Greek sculpture was originally painted in lifelike hues, contradicting the later belief that whiteness was an artistic ideal. What remains today is not ancient intention, but the residue of erosion, cleaning, and reinterpretation. These visual records align with ancient textual traditions that placed Spartan identity within a network of southern and eastern connections. Greek authors routinely traced cultural lineages toward Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia, regions viewed not as foreign anomalies but as sources of wisdom, ritual, and antiquity. Sparta's royal house, which claimed descent from Heracles, inherited a mythological lineage that extended well beyond the borders of Greece. Heracles himself was said to have traveled through Africa and the Near East, learning from older civilizations and drawing authority from lands south and east of the Aegean. Such stories mattered politically, because Spartan kingship rested on ancestry as much as power. Within this context, the letter recorded in 1 Maccabees 12 stands out not for its drama, but for its calm confidence. In this diplomatic correspondence, the Spartan king Arius speaks of kinship between Spartans and Jews, tracing a shared descent to Abraham. The tone is not poetic or symbolic, but formal and political, treating this connection as a known tradition rather than a novelty. Regardless of how later scholars debate its interpretation, the letter reveals something essential. Ancient elites did not find the idea of shared Afro-Asiatic ancestry implausible or threatening. It was later readers who became uncomfortable with its implications. This discomfort intensified centuries afterward, when European scholarship sought to reorganize the ancient world according to new hierarchies. Connections that once seemed ordinary were recast as errors or exaggerations. Artistic evidence was reframed, pigments ignored, and texts reread through assumptions that did not exist in antiquity. Over time, the Mediterranean became fragmented into artificial cultural compartments, and Sparta was repositioned as an isolated ancestor of Europe rather than a participant in a shared southern world. What makes this erasure so effective is its subtlety. No single source was destroyed. Instead, context was removed. Art was stripped of color. Texts were detached from geography. Myths were reinterpreted selectively. The result was a cleaner, simpler image, but one increasingly distant from the ancient reality. The Spartan elite, once understood as part of a complex Afro-Eurasian environment, became symbols rather than people shaped by place and history. When these strands are woven back together, the picture that emerges is not radical, but coherent. A society forged in the southern Mediterranean, linked by trade, myth, and movement to Africa and the Near East, would naturally reflect those connections in its culture and elite identity. The evidence does not demand a single label, but it resists erasure. It insists that Sparta cannot be understood honestly without acknowledging the wider world that shaped it. Restoring these connections does not diminish Sparta's legacy, it deepens it. Leonidas and his peers appear not as isolated figures molded for later ideals, but as leaders formed within an ancient continuum where boundaries were porous and identity was shaped by environment, ancestry, and exchange. What was minimized over time was not weakness, but complexity. So here, and it is within that complexity that the true history of Sparta continues to endure. As the story reaches its close, the image of Sparta that remains is far more complex, more human, and more rooted in its own ancient reality than the polished marble ideal inherited from later centuries. The warriors of Leonidas did not stand at Thermopylae as symbols of a modern racial myth, but as men shaped by a harsh land, an unforgiving sun, and a Mediterranean world where cultures, peoples, and ideas constantly flowed into one another. Their legacy belongs not to a single continent or ideology, but to an Afro-Mediterranean civilization whose boundaries were defined by sea routes, trade winds, and shared struggle rather than by modern concepts of race. The transformation of Sparta into a uniformly white ideal was not an innocent misunderstanding. During the 18th and 19th centuries, European scholars, artists, and political thinkers reimagined the ancient world through the lens of empire, by colonial expansion, and emerging racial hierarchies. Sparta, with its discipline, militarism, and rigid social order, became a convenient symbol to legitimize domination abroad and hierarchy at home. Statues were resculpted in pale marble tones, ancient descriptions were selectively interpreted, and inconvenient evidence was quietly ignored. Over time, this revised image hardened into something that felt timeless, even though it was anything but. Yet when we return to the ancient sources themselves, a different Sparta emerges. Classical writers placed the city firmly within a Mediterranean environment shared with North Africa, the Near East, and the wider Afro-Eurasian world. Art and material culture reveal color, texture, and physical diversity that later restorations stripped away. Even Spartan myths of origin, including traditions that linked them symbolically to peoples beyond Greece, hint at a broader cultural memory that resisted narrow definitions. Leonidas and his companions were not defending a racial abstraction. They were defending a way of life born from centuries of interaction, conflict, and exchange across the southern seas. Thermopylae, then, becomes more than a tale of heroic sacrifice. It stands as a reminder of how history is repeatedly reshaped by those who inherit it. The courage of the Spartans was real, but so too was the diversity of the world they came from, and the dependence of their society on peoples they ruled and feared. Understanding this fuller picture does not diminish Sparta's story. Instead, it restores its depth, placing it back into the vibrant, interconnected ancient Mediterranean, where it truly belonged. To see Sparta clearly is to recognize how the past can be claimed, altered, and weaponized. But also how it can be recovered through careful reading, archaeology, and a willingness to question inherited narratives. The true legacy of Leonidas is not found in marble whiteness or modern myth-making, but in the lived reality of an ancient world shaped by sun, sea, and shared humanity. Thank you for staying with this story until the end, and for taking the time to explore a deeper, more nuanced vision of the ancient past. If you found this journey meaningful and thought-provoking, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing for more stories that challenge what we think we know about history and bring forgotten worlds back into the light.